Is another financial crash about to sweep the world? That's the question many are asking in the wake of recent bank collapses, including Silicon Valley Bank, then New York's Signature Bank, followed by the Swiss National Bank having to step in to save lending giant Credit Suisse. All the usual suspects have stepped up to say all's well, nothing to see here. But just what's going on? Joining me now to contemplate what might happen next is GB News' own economist Liam Halligan. Good evening, Liam.
Evening, Neil.
What happened to the banks, Liam? And is it just a wobble, or is it the beginning of the end?
It's certainly a wobble, Neil. This is the most serious wobble to the global financial system, not so much since the 2008 financial crisis, but since the 2011-12 Eurozone crisis. You'll remember that, when the euro was in genuine danger of breaking up. That sent shockwaves across the global financial system. It's a combination of things, Neil. The global economy was absolutely hammered by lockdown, an unprecedented fall in GDP, gross domestic product, in countries across the world. Then on top of that, you had the huge shock of war in Ukraine, which has roiled global commodity markets, led to big spikes in the price of gas and oil, which remain hugely important to the global economy. Supply chains shattered across the world, food prices spiking, big inflation, the most serious inflation in 40 years in both the US, the UK, and across mainland Europe. And then the third big thing is that in response to that inflation, central banks around the world, not least the mighty US Federal Reserve and our own Bank of England, have rapidly raised interest rates. They were slow out of the blocks, particularly the Bank of England. They kept saying inflation, don't worry about it, it's going to be transitory. The people warning about it are talking nonsense. Well, of course, we weren't talking nonsense, Neil. We've had 10 increases in interest rates in a row in the UK, from half a percentage point at the start of last year to 4% now. There could be more to come. And all these things have seriously spooked global financial markets, and particularly certain types of banks that invested heavily in government bonds. And when those government bonds interest rates go up, the value of those government bonds falls, the bank's balance sheets look a lot weaker, all those things, and then an increasing suspicion among investors, among traders, and particularly among commentators, that those regulations that were put in place after the last seismic collapse in our banking system in 2008, which rocked the world economy. Many businesses, livelihoods have yet to recover from that.
Yep.
Was the regulation that was put in place after that Wall Street crash style reversal in global fortunes, Neil, was that regulation really all that good? Or was it watered down behind the scenes by powerful financial vested interests?
Yep.
It seems it may have been the latter.
I've got Jasmine Birtles here with me as well. Jasmine, how do you react to what Liam is saying? What's your take on say, Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse?
Yes, well, I agree with everything Liam says, but I would add that we are looking at a time where, for example, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, has told us that it's not a good idea to have more than £10,000 in our bank accounts. Now, we are covered up to £85,000 by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, but it's interesting that the FCA is saying, no, it's probably not great to have more than £10,000. I mean, they're saying you should go and, invest it elsewhere, quite right. But, I think a lot of people are wondering now. I mean, you mentioned in your monologue about banks asking what you're doing with your money. Why are you taking your money out and what are you wanting to do with it? I know quite a lot more people who are using cash now because they're not keen on using the digital. But there's a lot of people who are concerned.
In life generally, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So I want to know, yes, there's regulation, but what about the regulators? What does Liam have to say about them? Were they asleep at the wheel?
I think the post-2008 regulation was drastically watered down. It wasn't nearly as ambitious as it should have been. It took over a decade to implement some of the UK's main regulations, splitting up domestic regular banks, high street banks, the kind of banks used by ordinary firms and households where deposits are guaranteed, up to a certain point, splitting them up from the investment banks that do the high rolling, high risk, massively leveraged investments, the impact of which is magnified by the use of huge debt. Those two things must surely be split. But in many parts of the UK banking system and the US banking system, they're still together. So the investment banking guys, they have every incentive to take huge risks because they know that in the end, to secure the deposits of mom and pop, as we say, of ordinary people and businesses, the government will have to bail them out. Look, there's a really, really important academic in the US at Stanford called Anat Admati. She's a fabulous writer. She wrote a book called The Banker's New Clothes. I highly recommend it. She called this SVB situation and this Credit Suisse situation, she calls them a hostage-style situation, Neil. In other words, the state, the US, had to bail out Silicon Valley Bank, the Swiss, the European regulatory authorities had to bail out CSFB because a lot of these banks are simply still too big to fail. The banking system is too concentrated. And I keep hearing British government ministers, I keep hearing them say that the UK subsidiary of SVB, of Silicon Valley Bank, was bailed out at no cost to the taxpayer. The Prime Minister, he rolled it out in his list of recent achievements. That's nonsense. There is taxpayer involvement in the bailout of that bank, not least because the investors in that bank and the bank itself, their investments have been redeemed. They've been made whole, as they say, at par. So there is certainly central bank funding involved in the bailouts that are going on at the moment. And in the end, that will turn into government funding, or it could very easily. So it's not right to say that taxpayers aren't on the hook for this. And I worry, we had a huge collapse in 2008. We had a near miss in 2011. We've just had a lockdown. Increasingly, people are asking, was that really the right thing to do? If there's another banking collapse soon, I worry that a lot of ordinary folk are going to lose faith in our political...
Absolutely, Liam, absolutely. I'm going to have to jump in there, Liam, because I'm just...
losing faith in all the clever people who are meant to make all this complex stuff work.
Absolutely, Liam. I'm just being told I'm running out of time here. Always your insight is valuable and vital to me, so thank you once again for making time for me.